My mother is forcing me to take care of my estranged father after he abandoned us, and now she's threatening to cut me out of the will unless I obey her and take care of him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sitting in my mother's living room, I felt like I was 16 all over again, having just found out my father had walked out on us. Only this time, my mother wasn't crying and heartbroken. She was calm, almost cold as she laid down an ultimatum I never saw coming. I know this isn't what you want, Maya. 34F, she said in a firm voice. Her eyes steadied as she looked at me. But your father is struggling, and he has no one else. We need to help him. The we in that sentence really meant me, but she seemed completely oblivious to how wrong this felt. My father, the man who walked out on us over 20 years ago without a backward glance, was now sick, broke, and needing help. And for reasons I couldn't comprehend, my mother had decided I was the person who should be there for him. I shook my head, disbelief flooding me. Mom, he left us. He didn't even bother to keep in touch, didn't pay child support, didn't show up to my graduation, my wedding, anything. He's a stranger to me, and now you're telling me I need to take care of him. Her face hardened, and I could see that she rehearsed this, that she'd been ready for my resistance. Maya, you're the only one who can do this. You have the resources, and you live close enough to check in on him regularly. Besides, he's still your father. Blood is blood, and family takes care of each other. But he's not family, Mom. He forfeited that title when he left and never looked back. My voice trembled with the frustration I'd held onto for years, the resentment I'd pushed aside just to keep our lives as normal as possible. She looked at me with that same calm, an eerie contrast to my own turmoil. I understand that you have unresolved feelings, she said, her tone dismissive. But if you don't step up, there will be consequences. Consequences, I repeated, trying to wrap my mind around what she was implying. What are you talking about? Her lips tightened, and then she spoke the words I knew she'd been holding back. If you refuse to help him, Maya, I'll have no choice but to reconsider your place in the will. I want to leave things to someone who understands family duty, someone who knows what it means to stand by their kin, no matter the history. A chill ran through me. This wasn't about me helping my father. It was about her controlling me, forcing me into a role I'd never signed up for. She knew how much I depended on that inheritance to support my own family's future, to pay off our house and set up a college fund for my son. This wasn't just manipulation. It was a punishment. So you're saying, I began, struggling to keep my voice steady, that if I don't look after him, you're cutting me off? She nodded, her face completely unyielding. Yes, and I'm only asking for what's fair, Mia. He's your father, and you're the only family he has left. I sat there, feeling trapped in a nightmare that seemed impossible to escape. My own mother was blackmailing me into taking care of the man who had shattered our lives, and if I refused, she would strip me of everything I'd counted on for my family's future. It was as if I was losing both of them all over again. After a long silence, I finally stood up, swallowing the lump in my throat. I need some time to think about this, I said, my voice hollow. Take as long as you need, she replied, her voice softening slightly, though her gaze stayed cold and unwavering. But remember, family is what matters in the end. It's what keeps us strong, no matter what. Her words felt like a slap, a twisted reminder of a bond that no longer existed. I walked out of her house, feeling both numb and furious, wondering how I had ended up here, forced to choose between my principles and the future I'd worked so hard to secure. As I drove home, memories of my father drifted in and out, ghostly fragments of a man who had been little more than a shadow in my life. He'd abandoned us, left my mother and me to fend for ourselves, and now I was expected to care for him, to play the dutiful daughter he'd never bothered to know. It was impossible, unfair, and yet here I was being forced to make a decision that would alter everything. Back home, I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the walls as my mind whirled. Part of me knew I should call my husband Lucas, 35M, tell him everything, and let him help me figure it out. But the thought of explaining this whole mess, of dredging up the painful history of my father's abandonment, felt overwhelming. Instead, I reached out to my childhood friend, Sarah, 34F, who had been there through everything. She picked up after a few rings, her voice warm and familiar. Hey, Mia, it's been too long. How are things? I let out a shaky breath, grateful for her easygoing tone. Sarah, I'm not great, actually. I don't know where else to turn, and I really need someone to talk to. Her voice softened with concern. Of course. What's going on? I took a deep breath, explaining everything. My mother's demand, the ultimatum, the threat to cut me out of the will if I didn't comply. Sarah listened quietly, and when I finished, there was a long silence on her end. Maya, that's beyond unfair. She can't force you to do this. And to threaten your inheritance over it. That's manipulative, to say the least. I know, I replied, feeling a wave of relief that someone understood my frustration. But she's dead serious. And it's like she's turned it into some sort of test. She thinks I owe him this, that it's my duty as his daughter, even after everything he put us through. Sarah sighed. You don't owe him anything. He walked away, Mia. You were a kid. He was the one who was supposed to take care of you, not the other way around. I know, but if I don't do it, I'll lose everything I've counted on. I feel like I'm in a no-win situation. Listen, Mia, Sarah said, her voice steady. You have to decide what's right for you. If taking care of him would just bring more pain, then don't do it. But if you're worried about the inheritance, maybe there's a middle ground, some way to help that doesn't involve sacrificing your peace. Her words echoed in my mind as I hung up, grateful for her support yet still uncertain of what to do. I wanted to stand up to my mother, to tell her that I wouldn't be blackmailed into taking care of the man who had abandoned us. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the reality. My family's financial future was at stake. Days passed as I wrestled with my decision, feeling torn between two impossible choices. The memories of my father's absence weighed heavily on me, reminding me of all the years he missed, all the milestones he hadn't been there to see. And yet, my mother's words haunted me, a lingering reminder of the family loyalty she insisted was more important than my anger or resentment. In the end, I knew I had to face my mother again, to either stand my ground or find some way to navigate this impossible situation. A few days later, after agonizing over every angle of my situation, I found myself sitting in my mother's living room again. I hadn't made up my mind yet, but I was determined to try reasoning with her one more time. Maybe if I could make her see how deeply unfair this was, she'd understand. Or at least I hoped so. My mother sat across from me as unyielding as ever. Her face softened slightly as she glanced at me, but I could tell she wasn't planning to budge. Mom? I began, choosing my words carefully. I've thought a lot about what you're asking me to do, and I want you to understand. I'm not trying to ignore him or act like he doesn't matter. But I don't feel like I owe him anything. I don't have a relationship with him. He chose to leave, and that wasn't something either of us could control. She shook her head, folding her hands in her lap. You're right, Maya, you couldn't control that. But he's still your father, and he's reached a point in his life where he needs help. You've always been a good daughter to me. I don't understand why you can't extend that care to him, even if it's just for a short time. I took a steadying breath. Mom, do you realize how much you're asking of me? I'd be responsible for him, for his well-being, for his care, and I barely know him. It would hurt every single day, taking care of someone who chose to leave me behind. Someone who decided that I didn't matter enough to stick around. She sighed, her gaze turning steely. Maya, this isn't just about your feelings. It's about doing what's right. He may have made mistakes, but he's still family, and family takes care of each other. Family? I echoed, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. How is he family when he hasn't been around for most of my life? He's a stranger, and you want me to open my life to him, to be responsible for him when he couldn't even be responsible for his own daughter. She shook her head again, her expression unchanging. You're being selfish, Mia. You're putting your own anger ahead of what's right. I didn't raise you this way. The words stung, cutting into me like a knife. It's not selfish to want to protect myself from more pain, Mom. I'm not asking you to take care of him either. I know you're hurt by what he did. But blackmailing me into this by threatening the inheritance. That's not fair. She bristled at the word blackmail, her lips pressing into a thin line. I'm simply doing what's best for this family. I worked hard to build a life for you, to ensure you'd have a future even after he left. All I'm asking is that you show some loyalty to the man who, at the very least, gave you life. That's a twisted way of looking at it, Mom, I replied, feeling anger rising within me. You're asking me to sacrifice my peace, my emotional well-being for someone who didn't care enough to be there when I needed him. Why should I put him first now?" Her gaze hardened, the familiar coldness returning. "Because sometimes we have to put duty over our feelings, Mia. I thought you understood that. And if you don't want to help him, that's your choice. But don't expect me to look after you in the future if you choose to abandon your family now." I stared at her, feeling a strange numbness settle over me. This was my own mother, the woman who had raised me, who had stayed strong after my father's abandonment. And yet here she was, punishing me for not being willing to carry the burden that she herself couldn't bear. It felt like a betrayal of a different kind, one that cut even deeper than my father's abandonment. "Fine," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "If that's how you want it, then I'll take care of him. But know that it won't be because I want to. It'll be because you forced me into this, because you're holding my future hostage." She watched me, a flicker of relief softening her face, but I could see she wasn't about to apologize or relent. "It's for the best, Mia. Someday you'll understand that I'm doing this for your own good." I felt my throat tighten as I stood, grabbing my bag and heading for the door. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sense of betrayal was too raw, too overwhelming, and I needed space to process everything that had just happened. As I drove home, a heavy weight settled on my chest. My mother had manipulated me into taking on a role I never wanted, a responsibility I didn't ask for. And now, because of her ultimatum, I'd have to step into the role of caretaker for a man who had walked out on us when I was a child. A man who had left us to fend for ourselves without so much as a phone call, a card, or an explanation. I couldn't bear to tell Lucas just yet. The pain was too fresh, too raw, and I knew he would want to confront my mother, to protect me from the burden she was forcing on me. But I didn't want to risk jeopardizing our already strained family ties further. Instead, I swallowed the anger, pushing it down until I could think clearly. The next day, I reached out to the facility where my father had been staying, arranging a time to visit him. The woman I spoke to, a kind, gentle-sounding nurse, seemed relieved that someone was finally coming to see him. "He's been here a while," she said gently, "and I know he's been hoping for some family to visit." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. Family? The same man who had walked away, who had chosen a life without us, was now hoping for family to stand by him. The day of my visit arrived, and as I pulled up to the facility, I felt a strange mix of dread and resentment twist inside me. The building was quiet, with a landscaped garden out front that seemed to mock the bleakness I felt. Inside, the receptionist directed me to a small room near the end of the hall, where she said he would be waiting. When I entered, I saw him immediately. Older, frailer than I remembered, his once dark hair now a thinning gray. He sat hunched in a chair, his face turned toward the window. He looked so much smaller than the man I had once imagined, so much weaker than the father I'd conjured in my mind on the rare occasions I let myself wonder where he'd gone. I cleared my throat, and he turned slowly, his eyes widening as they settled on me. For a moment, I saw a glimmer of recognition, a spark of something I couldn't quite place. "Maya?" he asked, his voice raspy, uncertain. I nodded, keeping my expression unreadable. "Yes, it's me." His gaze softened, a mixture of relief and something that looked like regret. You came. I wasn't sure you would." I shrugged, crossing my arms as I stood a few feet away from him. It wasn't exactly my choice. Mom made it clear that I didn't have many options. He looked down, his face clouded with something akin to shame. "I know I haven't been the father you needed. I know I made mistakes, Mia." "Mistakes," I repeated, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. "Walking out on your family, never contacting us, leaving us to figure everything out on our own. That's more than a mistake." He looked away, nodding slowly. "You're right. It was more than that. I was weak. I didn't know how to handle everything. And by the time I thought about coming back, it felt like too much time had passed." I felt a surge of anger. "That's your excuse. You just didn't come back because you thought too much time had passed." He winced, and for a moment, he looked genuinely pained. "I know it's not enough. I can't make up for it, Mia. I can only ask for your forgiveness." The word forgiveness felt hollow, empty. I didn't know if I could forgive him, let alone feel anything other than resentment. And yet, here he was, sitting before me, broken and desperate, waiting for some kind of absolution that I wasn't sure I could give. I took a steadying breath, my mind churning with conflicted emotions. I didn't come here for forgiveness, I said finally, my voice steady. I came because I was forced to. But I'll do what needs to be done to help you get through this. Nothing more, nothing less. He nodded, a faint look of sadness in his eyes. I understand. And thank you, Mia. Even if it's not what you want, thank you. I said nothing, turning my gaze toward the window, feeling the weight of my mother's ultimatum, my father's abandonment, and the impossible situation they'd left me in. All I knew was that I'd made a choice, and now I'd have to live with it. In the following weeks, I settled into a reluctant routine, dividing my time between my own life and the care of my estranged father. Every few days, I'd drive to the care facility, where I'd sit with him in the same sterile room, helping him with small tasks, listening as he tried to fill the decades he'd missed. At first, I kept our conversations short, guarded, unwilling to let him see how hurt I was. It felt strange, playing the role of caretaker for a man who was, essentially, a stranger. A part of me had expected him to push back, to maybe insist he didn't need my help, but instead, he seemed almost resigned, as if he were just grateful to have anyone there, even if that someone was me. One afternoon, as I helped him organize some papers, a mess of documents from his recent medical expenses, insurance claims, and overdue bills, he finally broke the silence that had stretched between us for the past few visits. Maya, he began, his voice quiet, I know you don't want to be here. I can feel it every time you come, and I don't blame you. You have every right to be angry, but I hope you'll give me a chance to explain. I paused, my hands freezing over a stack of paperwork. Part of me wanted to shut him down immediately, to say I wasn't interested in hearing his justifications or apologies. But another part of me, the part that had spent so many years wondering, itching for answers, found itself listening. I nodded, swallowing hard. Fine, explain. He let out a long, weary sigh, his gaze distant as he seemed to gather his thoughts. When I left, your mother and I were in a bad place. We were both young, angry, and trying to make things work when they clearly weren't. I wasn't happy, and I didn't know how to fix it. But I was also scared. Scared that staying would just make things worse for both of you. I kept my expression neutral, refusing to let him see the effect his words were having on me. So you just left. Without a word, without trying to work things out. He winced, nodding slowly. Yes, I took the easy way out. I told myself it was for the best, that you'd be better off without me there. But over time, I realized that was just an excuse. I convinced myself that it was too late to come back, too late to try to make amends. And by then, well, I'd gone down a path I didn't know how to come back from. His words hit me harder than I expected, a mix of hurt and bitterness rising within me. So what changed? Why now? He looked down, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of a piece of paper. I got sick. I had a lot of time to think, to reflect on my life. I realized I didn't want to go through the rest of it alone, knowing I'd abandoned the only family I ever had. I wanted to scream, to tell them how unfair it was that he'd only chosen to seek me out when he had nothing left, when he was at his lowest. But I kept my composure, keeping my voice calm. So you want me to forgive you now, after all these years? He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. I know it's a lot to ask, Mia, but I'm not asking you to forget what I did. I just want a chance to make things right. The words lingered in the air between us, heavy and filled with a desperation that twisted painfully inside me. I wanted to be strong, to tell him that he forfeited his right to make things right. But as I looked at him, older, frailer, and visibly haunted by his choices, I felt my anger waver just a little. After a long silence, I finally spoke, my voice steady. I'm here because Mom gave me an ultimatum. I'm not here out of forgiveness, or because I want to fix anything. But I'll help you as much as I can. Just don't expect anything more. He nodded, a look of quiet acceptance on his face. I understand. And thank you, Mia, for even being willing to do that. The weeks went by, each visit with my father a little easier than the last. He shared small stories from his life, details about jobs he'd taken, places he'd lived, things he'd done to try and forget his past. Slowly, I found myself softening, my curiosity slipping through my defenses as I listened to him talk. I was still angry, but I began to realize that part of my anger stemmed from a place of longing, for answers, for closure, for the understanding I'd never been given as a child. One afternoon, after a particularly quiet visit, he looked at me with a hesitancy I hadn't seen before. "Maya, there's something I've wanted to ask you for a while, but I haven't known how to say it." I braced myself, uncertain of what he might ask. "What is it?" He took a breath, his gaze earnest. Do you think you'd ever be open to starting over? I know I can't be the father you needed back then, but maybe I can be here for you now, in whatever way you'd allow." The question caught me off guard, a mixture of emotions flooding me as I processed his words. Part of me wanted to say no, to tell him that he'd had his chance and that I didn't need him now. But another part of me, a part I'd buried deep down, felt a glimmer of hope, an almost painful longing for the father I'd never had. I looked away, my throat tight. "I don't know if I can do that. It's a lot to ask." He nodded, his expression softening with a quiet understanding. "I know. I don't expect you to answer now. Just think about it. I'll take whatever time you need." After that conversation, my visits took on a different tone. I began sharing bits and pieces of my own life, cautiously opening up about my work, my family, my son. He listened intently, his gaze warm and attentive, and I began to see glimmers of the father I'd always wished he could be. But there were still moments of resentment, of anger that simmered just below the surface. I couldn't forget the years of absence, the milestones he'd missed, the pain he left in his wake. And as much as I wanted to believe he was sincere, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was only reaching out now because he needed something. From me, from the life he'd abandoned. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, I confided in Lucas, telling him about the conversations I'd been having with my father, the possibility he'd offered of starting over. Lucas listened quietly, his hand resting gently over mine. "How do you feel about that? Do you think you could ever forgive him?" I let out a long sigh, feeling the weight of the question. "I don't know. Part of me wants to, I think. But the other part of me, it's hard to let go of everything he did, everything he put us through. It feels like I'd be letting him off the hook too easily." Lucas nodded, his gaze steady. "Forgiving him doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean you owe him a relationship either. If you want to give him a second chance, that's your choice. But don't feel pressured to rush it. You get to take this at your own pace." His words gave me a strange sense of relief. I realized that I didn't need to decide everything right now, that I could let this process unfold, piece by piece, until I understood what I truly wanted. In the days that followed, I continued my visits, still guarded but a little more open to the possibility of something new. My father's stories became windows into a life I hadn't known, and I began to see him less as a ghost from my past and more as a complex, flawed person who had made mistakes. One evening, as I was about to leave, he reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he caught mine. "Maya, I know I've lost so much time with you. But whatever time I might have left, I want to spend it trying to make things right. If you'll let me." I looked down at his hand, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. Slowly, I nodded, my voice soft. "I can't promise anything. But I'll try." For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, small and tentative, but real. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning, a fragile step toward healing the wounds that had shaped so much of my life. And as I walked away that night, I felt a flicker of hope, a quiet assurance that maybe, just maybe, some things could be mended, even if they could never be the same. The following months were a strange, bittersweet blend of healing and old wounds reopening. As I settled into the rhythm of visiting my father, I found myself letting down my guard a little more each time. Our conversations began to go deeper. He shared memories from his past, regrets he'd never voiced to anyone, and glimpses into the man he'd been before everything fell apart. Slowly, I could see he was genuinely trying, and there were moments where I'd catch myself almost seeing him as a father, a person I might have had in my life under different circumstances. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting workday, I arrived at the facility and found him sitting by the window, gazing out over the garden with a faint smile. He looked peaceful, even hopeful, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of something I wasn't sure how to name. Regret? Longing? I couldn't say. "Hey, Dad, I greeted him, feeling the words slip out before I could stop it. It startled us both, hanging in the air between us. It was the first time I'd called him that since I was a little girl, and I saw a glimmer of emotion in his eyes, something vulnerable and raw. "Maya," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "you have no idea what it means to hear you call me that." I felt myself choke up, memories flashing through my mind, the early years of confusion, anger, sadness, and loss. "It doesn't mean I've forgiven you," I said slowly, holding his gaze. "But I'm trying. I just need time." He nodded, the weight of my words visibly settling over him. "I understand. And I'm so grateful for whatever you're willing to give, even if it's just time." We fell into a comfortable silence after that, and it was the first time I felt like we were truly on equal ground. Two people willing to try, not bound by old expectations or the weight of the past. On my drive home that day, I found myself wondering if I could ever fully forgive him, if there would ever be a day when I didn't feel the sting of abandonment lingering beneath the surface. But I also felt something new, a cautious hope that maybe this fragile connection could evolve into something real. For the first time, I saw a future where the anger didn't have to define me, where I could start to let go of the bitterness that had become so much a part of my life. That evening, as I recounted the visit to Lucas, he listened with quiet support, his hand resting on mine. "You're really brave, you know," he said, his gaze warm. "It takes strength to face this, to even let him in a little. I'm proud of you." I felt a flush of gratitude, his words filling me with the courage I needed to keep going. "Thank you," I replied, feeling a surge of affection for him. "I don't know what I'd do without you here to remind me of who I am." The following weekend, my mother called unexpectedly. She hadn't been very involved in the situation since I'd started seeing my father, only reaching out occasionally to ask how things were going. She hadn't once asked about him directly, and her silence on the subject told me that she, too, was struggling with complex emotions. "Maya," she began, her voice oddly tense, "I just wanted to check in. Are you still visiting him regularly?" "Yes," I replied cautiously, unsure of where this was going. "I see him a few times a week." She paused, and I could hear the tension in her voice. "And how is it? Is he asking anything of you? Trying to get you to forgive him?" I could feel the resentment in her tone, and it brought back my own frustration. "Mom, he's not trying to manipulate me if that's what you're worried about. We're just trying to connect. I'm not saying everything is perfect, but I'm willing to see where it goes." Her silence lingered, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost hesitant. "I just don't want you to get hurt, Mia. I know you're stronger than you used to be, but people don't change easily, and he might take advantage of your kindness." I understood her fears, even if they came from a place of hurt she hadn't been able to let go of. "Mom, I appreciate your concern, but I need to do this on my terms. I know it's complicated, and I don't expect you to be involved if you don't want to be. But it's something I need to face for myself." She let out a long, resigned sigh. "I don't understand it, Mia, but I trust you to make the right decision. Just be careful. You're opening yourself up to a lot of pain." After we hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. My mother's fears mirrored my own, and it was as though she saw my father only as the man who had left us, while I was slowly starting to see him as more. Her reaction made me realize that part of my journey wasn't just reconciling with him, but reconciling with my own anger and resentment, breaking free of the past that had shaped so much of my life. The next few weeks with my father were filled with small moments of connection and quiet understanding. I started to notice a change in him, a gentleness that felt unfamiliar but genuine. He asked questions about my life, my family, my work. Sometimes I'd catch a look of pride in his eyes when I told him about my accomplishments, and each time it filled me with a strange warmth, a glimpse of the relationship we might have had if things had been different. Then, one evening as I was leaving, he asked if I would consider coming back the next day. "There's something important I want to give you, something I've held on to for a long time," he said, his tone serious. The next day, I returned, finding him waiting with an old, worn box in his hands. He handed it to me, his expression solemn. "I saved these for you, Mia. I didn't think I'd ever get the chance to give them to you, but, well, I'd like you to have them now." Inside were old photos of us together, mementos from my childhood that I hadn't seen in years. pictures of us on my birthdays, a lock of my hair from my first haircut, and a small card with my name written in his familiar handwriting. He had kept these pieces of my life, even while he'd been absent, and the realization brought a lump to my throat. "I know it doesn't change anything," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But I thought of you every day, even when I wasn't there. I kept these things because they reminded me of the family I left behind, the life I should have had with you." The sincerity in his words struck me deeply, and for the first time, I felt the anger within me soften. He had made choices that hurt me, choices he couldn't take back, but he had held onto the memories, clinging to fragments of a life he had let go of but never truly forgotten. As I drove home that night, the box beside me, I felt a shift, a quiet sense of closure that had been eluding me for so long. Maybe I could forgive him, not because he deserved it, but because I was ready to let go of the weight I'd been carrying. Forgiveness wouldn't erase the past, but it could allow me to move forward, to find peace in the present rather than clinging to the pain of what had been. When I arrived home, Lucas was waiting for me, sensing the change in my demeanor. I showed him the box, the memories it held, and as we sat together, I felt a sense of release, a sense of healing that I hadn't thought possible. The road ahead with my father wouldn't be easy. There would be moments of struggle, of anger, of regret, but I knew I was ready to face it, not as a duty or an obligation, but as a choice to build something new, even if it would never be what I'd once imagined. As I closed the box and placed it on the shelf, I knew I'd made peace with the past, and that was enough. I was finally free. In the months that followed, my father's health declined, and I found myself at his side more frequently, helping with small tasks, managing his medications, and ensuring he was comfortable. Each visit brought us closer, bridging the gap that had once felt impossible to cross. My anger and resentment had softened into something I hadn't anticipated. Compassion, maybe even love. Not the same love I had for Lucas or my son, but a complicated, bittersweet love tinged with forgiveness. One evening, as I helped him adjust his blanket, he reached for my hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his frailty. "Ma," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "I just want you to know that if I could go back, I would do things differently. I would have stayed, been there for you and your mother. I can never make it right, but I hope you know how deeply sorry I am." His words washed over me, and I could see the regret in his eyes, a weight he had carried all these years. I'd heard apologies from him before, but something about this moment felt final, like he was surrendering the last pieces of his pride to offer me closure. "I know, Dad," I replied, the word dad now feeling natural, genuine. I think I'm ready to let it go. The past won't change, but I don't want to carry it with me anymore." He nodded, a faint smile softening his expression. "You've given me more than I deserve, Mia. More than I could have asked for. Thank you for everything." We stayed like that, hand in hand, the silence between us filled with an understanding we hadn't needed words to express. And for the first time, I felt a peace I hadn't known before. A release from the anger, the pain, and the years of resentment that had once defined our relationship. Over the next few weeks, my mother reached out more frequently, asking how things were going and even offering to visit him, though she never quite followed through. I could sense her lingering resentment, her refusal to fully let go, and while I understood it, I no longer shared it. This journey had been mine alone, and I had found the healing I needed, even if she hadn't. Then, one morning, I received a call from the facility. My father had taken a turn for the worse. I drove there in a haze, my heart pounding with a mix of grief and gratitude for the time we'd shared. When I arrived, he was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. I took his hand, feeling the frailty of it, the warmth that was fading too quickly. He opened his eyes, a faint glimmer of recognition in his gaze. "Maya," he whispered, his voice so soft I had to lean in to hear him. "Thank you for giving me a second chance. For letting me be your father." A tear slipped up my cheek as I squeezed his hand. "Thank you for trying," I replied, my voice steady even as my heart broke. "You were here when it mattered." With a final, faint smile, he closed his eyes, his breathing slowing until it stopped altogether. I stayed with him, holding his hand, letting the wave of grief wash over me but feeling a strange sense of relief as well, a knowledge that I had done all I could to heal what had once seemed irreparable. The funeral was small, with only a few of his old friends and some distant family members. My mother chose not to attend, and while that hurt, I understood. She hadn't been able to forgive him, hadn't been able to find the same peace I had. But as I stood by his graveside, Lucas and my son beside me, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance that I had done what I needed to do, not for him, but for myself. A week later, my mother asked me to come over, saying she wanted to talk. When I arrived, she seemed more subdued than usual, her gaze avoiding mine as she gestured for me to sit. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry, Mia," she began, her voice trembling, "for forcing you into this. I thought I was doing what was right, that if you took care of him, you'd understand why I stayed with him for so long, why I couldn't let go. But now, I realized that wasn't fair to you." I looked at her, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. "I think I needed this, Mom. I needed to find my own peace with him, to make sense of it in my own way. And I did. So maybe it was worth it." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I couldn't forgive him. I wanted to, but I couldn't. And I pushed you because I didn't want you to carry the same anger. I see now that I was wrong." I reached out, taking her hand. "You did what you thought was best, and it helped me find my own way. So thank you for pushing me, even if it hurt. I think I finally understand why you stayed strong all those years." She gave a shaky smile, squeezing my hand. "You're stronger than I ever was, Mia, and I'm so proud of you." From that day on, our relationship shifted, growing stronger in ways I hadn't expected. The shared pain, the lingering wounds, it all softened as we both worked to let go, to find our own paths to healing. For the first time in years, I felt close to my mother, like we were allies in the journey toward acceptance and forgiveness. Months passed, and as life settled back into its familiar rhythm, I found myself feeling lighter, unburdened by the weight I'd carried for so long. The anger, the resentment, the loss, it was still there, but it no longer defined me. I'd allowed myself to grieve, to let go, and in doing so, I had opened myself up to a life free from the shadows of the past. One evening, as I watched my son playing in the yard, Lucas came up beside me, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "You've come a long way, Mia," he said softly, his voice filled with pride. I smiled, leaning into him. "I have, and it feels good, like I'm finally free." He kissed my forehead, his embrace warm and steady. "You deserve that freedom, and whatever comes next, I'll be here with you." I took his hand, feeling a deep gratitude for the journey that had brought me here, the journey that had tested and strengthened me in ways I hadn't expected. I found forgiveness, not because anyone had asked me to, but because I was ready to reclaim my own peace, my own happiness. As the sun set over our home, casting a golden glow over the yard, I knew that I had finally found what I'd been searching for all along, a sense of wholeness, a life I could live without regrets, and a future that was truly my own.